I'm going to talk about where the problem has come from that we're all confronted with, because you know that I am a historian in background. I shall argue that the transgender rights movement is actually a men's sexual rights movement. It's one aspect of the phenomenon that's been taking place since the so-called sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s, of establishing men's sexual freedom and their freedom to exercise the male sex right. The so-called sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s unleashed a men's sexual liberation movement, which required that women and girls service men's sexual desires. From it grew the sex industry in the form of pornography and the toleration or legalization of all forms of prostitution. What were once called the sexual perversions were also released, and they became to be seen as an important part of men's liberation. Their practitioners were relabeled as erotic or sexual minorities, and they set about campaigning for their rights. The practices that men's rights campaigners sought to normalize included, alongside their use of women in pornography and prostitution, sadomasochism, paedophilia, and transvestism, which is now more generally called transgenderism. A men's sexual freedom agenda is in opposition to the rights of women to be free from violence and coercion, the rights to privacy and dignity, and to the integrity of their bodies. The transgender sexual rights movement threatens the very existence of the category of women in law and in social policy. The transgender activists deny that their interest in cross-dressing is a form of sexual fetishism, because this would be harmful to their agenda. But because they pretend to be a special kind of person, one who through the exercise of a sorry fate was given a female brain in a male body, they are now receiving support from governments, councils, charities, human rights organizations, the UN, and the medical profession, of course, in their campaign to destroy women's human rights. Now, I want to talk about sexual rights. Do sexual rights exist? There are no UN documents which talk about sexual rights. When sexual rights are a part of rights speech, they are generally seen as a part of women's rights, and specifically women's reproductive rights. I should say by UN documents, I mean conventions. So there's no sexual rights in the conventions. The struggle to get recognition that women's rights are human rights has been long and hard. And the original UN conventions, of course, omitted the rights, the specific rights of women. They were based on what was important to men, voting rights, rights not to be unjustly provisioned, the right not to be murdered by the state. And this was only remedied to some extent in the Women's Convention, or CEDAW, in 1979. CEDAW, though, seeks to expand traditional human rights understandings to fit women in, and it doesn't cover issues that are fundamental to women, such as violence against women and reproductive rights. Though much work has been done by feminists to make these issues part of human rights discourse. Reproductive rights are now defined as human rights by organizations such as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. But there's too much opposition within the human rights system from misogynist religious organizations, both Christian and Muslim, for reproductive rights such as abortion to ever have a place in a UN convention. Sexual rights are commonly understood to be part of reproductive rights by rights bodies and in rights discussions. They are seen as an aspect of health and tend to refer to women's rights to the integrity of our bodies and to be protected from rape and sexual violence, unwanted childbearing and child marriage. There is no recognition of men's sexual rights as human rights in rights documents because men are not a group in need of rights protection. Women's sexual rights, though, consist of women's rights to escape and be protected from the exercise of the male sex right, or to survive its consequences, such as in abortion rights. I want to explain what the male sex right consists of. Men do not require protection for the male sex right because this is not under threat. Instead, there is a recognition so axiomatic, so generally accepted that it requires no mention, that men do have the right to use women and children for sexual pleasure and to treat them just as objects for their satisfaction. This is clear from the way that governments and legal systems the world over have traditionally protected and promoted men's rights to use women and girls in the sex industry. This is beginning to change, of course, mainly as a result of feminist campaigning. And now a few countries such as Sweden, France, Norway, and Ireland accept that prostitution is a violation of women's human rights and have enacted laws that penalize male buyers in order to undermine the industry. But in the vast majority of countries, strip clubs, brothels, escort agencies, street prostitution, online prostitution, webcam prostitution and pornography thrive and are protected by the state. The assumption underlying this is that men do have what the feminist political theorist Carol Pateman calls the male sex right. To satisfy men sexually, male states, or pimp states, as feminists call them, tolerate or legalize prostitution, in which women are abused in the streets or hotel rooms, or trafficked to the homes of abusers, and warehoused in strip clubs and brothels in which they often also sleep and spend their whole time. In some parts of Asia, there are prostitution towns in which women and their girl children spend their whole lives servicing customers and receiving their ejaculate. The slavish servicing of the male sex right in wartime and in peace is so egregious that it does suggest that pimp states, which is all states that do not have comprehensive legislation to protect women against exploitation in porn and prostitution, consider that men have a right to be sexually satisfied by having women and girls presented to them in all possible ways for their pleasure. Men presently exercise their male sex right in myriad ways which harm or destroy the lives of women and girls. The male sex right is expressed in the sexual harassment and rape that create a sexualized environment which women have to navigate with extreme care at work, at home, in the street, on transport, in places of entertainment. This constant sexual pressure which women are under is seen as natural, simply how men are, and women must accept it if they're not to be seen as man-haters. In the book I'm writing at the moment, I'm looking at the ways in which the male sex right constructs the world and women's experiences of it. This goes far beyond what may be understood as male violence. The ordinary exercise of the male sex right, which is commonly just called sex, involves men simply using women's bodies as masturbation aids, whether women like it or not. The best example I've come across of this was listening to a Bangladeshi feminist, Farida Akhtar, explaining how men would come back to the hut from work at lunchtime to be fed by their wives, and would then take them out of the hut to penetrate them up against the back wall. In the UK, marital rape was not a crime in law until 1991. And the law doesn't make much difference because men still regularly use their wives despite their reluctance. Women's compliance is exacted by sex advice literature, such as that of Bettina Arndt in Australia, who last year won an Order of Australia award. Her books tell women that they must service men for as long as and whenever those men require it. They must not, Arndt says, turn off the sex supply. We, women, are the supply. There are numerous other ways in which the exercise of the male sex right constructs the world for women. It determines where women can go in a city, whether they can enjoy a night out, whether they have to technologize their bodies to prevent conception or seek abortion, how many children they have, the advertising that forms the backdrop of the city streets they walk down, and whether they have to live with the stress of unwanted sex or their male partner's anger. It constructs how they have to dress, the crippling shoes they have to wear, and the masks they have to put on their faces. There are so many ways, and I can't talk about them all today. What I do want to talk about is the new problems for women that have been unleashed since the 1960s sexual revolution, and particularly since the development of the internet and the pornography industry. This consists of the normalizing of what the sexologists, the scientists of sex, used to call the sexual perversions. The sexual perversions represent more unusual forms of male sexual behavior. Until the gay liberation movement of the 1970s, homosexuality was included amongst lists of the perversions. But the gay rights movement was successful in getting homosexuality destigmatized, and in 1973 it was removed as a psychiatric diagnosis from the DSM, which is the Bible of US psychiatry. Homosexuality is about wanted sexual relationships between adults and does not have victims. The perversions are forms of male sexual behavior which do have victims and have harmful effect on women's lives. Male sexuality is constructed to be the sexuality of the dominant class and in relation to women's oppression. Transvestism, or as it is more generally called these days, transgenderism, is the most significant in the threat it poses to women's rights in the present. In the late 19th century, the new science of sexology began to map these forms of male sexual behavior and give them names. Many took the form of what the scientists called fetishism, i.e. concentrating sexual interest on objects that represented women, such as high-heeled shoes, rather than an actual woman. Men might then either wear large-size high-heeled shoes themselves or ejaculate into high-heeled shoes. The objects might be related to women's bodies, such as hair. Men who stole women's hair to masturbate on, cutting off women's plaits, for instance, were called capillary kleptomaniacs. Men's hair fetishism is why the vast majority of young women today have long hair, which is extremely inconvenient but exciting to men. Men who liked women to be dirty were called soleromaniacs. One version of this is paying women to mud wrestle. There was a very wide range of perversions recorded in the early part of the 20th century by the scientists of sex. The perversions included renifleurism, in which men would gain satisfaction from smells, particularly the smell of urine. In urolagnia, men get excitement from watching women urinate. There were gay forms of urolagnia too. In one case in the medical literature, a man would go into the men's toilets and get other men to urinate into his coat pockets. In coprophilia, men were excited by shit, and in coprophagia, men seek to eat women's shit by visiting prostituted women and eating their shit off teaspoons, for instance. There are occasional media reports of men doing any or all of these things today. Usually women and girls are the objects of these practices and experience distress, if not more serious forms of harm. Women do not have perversions, according to the sexologists, although they don't explain why. When it came to explanation, the sexologists usually said that the men's behavior was the result of the way that their mothers had behaved towards them. In one case, apparently a mother wore very large hats, and that caused her son to do indecent exposure. They never mentioned the power relations between men and women, which actually cause, in my understanding, the sexual behavior of the ruling class to be so distorted. Now, what has happened in the last few decades is the normalization of men's sexual perversions. And as they are normalized, the language has, of course, had to be changed. The language has changed very much over the last half century, and the changes are designed to reduce stigma. The word perversion could suggest disapproval, so it was replaced with sexual deviation and now paraphilia. Pedophiles became minority-attracted persons. I want to say something about pedophiles because they were the first group of men who had previously been seen as perverts to emerge demanding their sexual rights. Though the vast majority of the children who are sexually abused are girls, it is not heterosexual pedophiles that came forward to lead a movement for their rights, but gay men. The paedophile movement in the 1970s was composed almost entirely of gay men. The groups that demanded abolition or reduction of the age of consent so that the men could have legal sexual access to children were gay male groups like the Paedophile Information Exchange in the UK or NAMBLA in the US. These men, though, did not demand their own sexual rights. No. They said they were simply campaigning for the rights of children to have their own sexuality, which would include wanting to be penetrated by middle-aged men. The paedophiles campaigned, they said, for children's sexuality rights. They were defeated at that time, particularly by radical feminists. I was in a group in the late 70s which fought to keep the age of consent. They have started campaigning again in recent years as minority attracted persons. They use many of the old arguments, but also claim to be an oppressed group who are made very unhappy by social stigma and the difficulty of coming out to their families and friends. They are still predominantly gay. Heterosexual paedophiles who want access to girl children do not campaign in this way. It is feminists who have fought to place limits on men's demands for the male sex right to be extended. We've had to fight the left. In the 1970s, the paedophile groups were supported by mainstream gay organisations and publications in the UK. But also, the Paedophile Information Exchange was affiliated to the National Council for Civil Liberties, which is now Liberty, the main rights organisation in the UK, for several years with no objections. In the early 1980s, a number of members of PI were prosecuted for sexual acts with children, and the group was disbanded in 1983. The paedophile movement was as acceptable in the late 1970s and early 1980s as the transgender rights movement is today. Then, as now, feminists opposed the men's demands, and the left supported them. There are fascinating similarities. The new movement of minority-attracted persons is seeking to gain recognition of paedophilia as a sexual orientation. By saying that they have a sexual orientation like homosexuals, paedophiles imply that they cannot help themselves, and they demand sympathy as an oppressed sexual minority. In the 1990s, another group of those who would once have been called perverts began to campaign for their rights, and they are the transvestites. So now I want to look at the transgender rights movement. The transgender rights movement was created in the 1970s by heterosexual men who are transvestites. These heterosexual men are the force behind this movement and constitute the vast majority of those who are in leadership positions. I will not consider today the women or the gay men who are transgender, but I'm happy to answer questions about how these fit in. In the early part of the 20th century, the scientists said that these men simply had the sexual fetish of transvestism or cross-dressing. They did not suggest that they could change sex. In the mid-century, the technologies that enabled the scientists to change people's bodies were developed, plastic surgery in particular. They began to create what they called transsexuals, and to see these men as a different category from the ordinary transvestites, because they wanted to impersonate women all the time instead of just occasionally. To justify this, they developed the concept of gender identity disorder. Now, gender identity disorder also, though it started out as gender identity disorder, had its name changed. It entered the DSM, the US Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in 1980. Some saw gender identity disorder as a substitute for homosexuality, which had been removed in 1973. The transgender activists of the new transgender rights movement did not like the fact that their sexual interests were called a disorder, and they applied pressure to get the name of the condition changed in 2013 to gender dysphoria. Transvestic fetishism remains, though, in the DSM. So there are now two diagnoses: men who are sexually excited to wear women's clothes, who are transvestic fetishists, and men with gender dysphoria, which supposedly represents a more permanent condition, which may, the scientists acknowledge, develop from transvestic disorder, and of course develops from the use of transgender pornography. And there's a lot of information on social media in which men who transgender have say that it's because they watch sissy pornography or transgender pornography, and that caused them to develop this particular behavior. Men can graduate into thinking they must really be women after years of cross-dressing. That is what the sexologists say to us, but they try to make a distinction between the diagnoses. The history of the changes in the way in which transgenderism has been understood and described in the DSM and in sexological literature is fascinating, and it shows the degree of pressure that the transgender rights movement has been bringing to bear. Because the literature is technical and not read by many feminists, we've not been able to observe how the ground has moved under our feet until recently, when the new confidence of cross-dressers has allowed them to step out of the medical textbooks and into our toilets. So pornography has supercharged many of men's perversions, such as nappy fetishism, paedophilia, sadomasochism, and transgenderism. And of course, there are separate and profitable porn niches for all the perversions. Though most of the medical profession now seems to accept that there can be such a thing as an innate but misplaced gender identity, many have resisted this idea and continue to see all the heterosexual men who cross-dress as sexually motivated, a problem they call autogynephilia, or love of the woman in themselves. They do not entertain the idea that their patients can really change their gender or sex. And this group, including Ray Blanchard, Michael Bailey, and Anne Lawrence, who is a cross-dressing man, maintain the understanding that transgenderism is not about an essence of femininity but sexual, and they use autogynephilia to describe it. Now, there are a variety of forms of autogynephile behavior which Blanchard and the other sexologists describe and differentiate. One group of autogynephiles is interested only in wearing what they see as women's clothes. They might only want to wear women's underwear, probably frilly and uncomfortable under their work suits, or they may want to walk out in public looking like a porn star. Some of this group will have a past as teenagers when they were snowdroppers. That means that they stole women's underwear from washing lines to masturbate in. Another group likes to do what they see as women's activities, so they knit, or they will visit women in prostitution and get those women to force them to do the housework. They do not, of course, do any housework at home because it's a degrading activity, so they only want to do it when it's sexually exciting to feel degraded. There are men who try to imitate women's biology, and they will seek tampons, use tampons in bins in the women's toilets and stuff them up their bottoms. There are men who wear lycra bodysuits and try to have women's body parts. And then there are men who seek to actually have women's body parts through surgery, and those are the ones who would once have been called transsexuals. They are likely to have other co-paraphilias, that is related paraphilias alongside that, such as apotemnophilia, which means wanting to have a disability. So men who have apotemnophilia, and often they are transvestites as well, want to get doctors to break their backs, for instance, so that they can be disabled and have to be in a wheelchair, or they want to get legs amputated. And indeed, there was a Scottish surgeon in the early 2000s who did amputate healthy legs from two men because before it was stopped, and they wanted their legs amputated. There was a gay website at that time, a gay disability website, where men talked about fondling stumps. So you can see that there's a variety of ways in which men can exercise their perversions. Now, how does this form a threat to women's sex-based rights? The transgender rights movement has campaigned since the 1990s for their right to the protection of the law for the expression of their gender identities, and their demands have gradually escalated. International bodies, national legislatures, and many local governments and organizations have been overwhelmed by the huge money and influence of the movement's sponsors. These include the pharmaceutical companies that profit from putting people, often from childhood, on their drugs for life, and includes billionaire cross-dressing philanthropists. The transgender activists demand that they should be able to be recognised as women in law and have access to all the spaces, sports, opportunities that have been allocated to women to alleviate the severe discrimination and violence that women suffer from men under male domination. Women's rights, of course, are based on biological sex, not gender. The Declaration explains the way in which including men with gender identities in the category of women undermines or overturns the rights that CEDAW and subsequent international documents have assigned to women based not upon gender, but biological sex. All of these are explained in some detail in the Declaration, so I will give only a couple of examples here. Where once transvestites would have quietly masturbated into high-heeled shoes or dressed up in frilly underwear at special weekends away, or attended clubs where they could dress in private, they now feel entitled to pretend to be women in women's spaces. They get particular sexual satisfaction from being recognized as women. So we are all conscripted into being the unwilling bit players in these men's sexual fantasies. We are the audience. And indeed, the audience is very important, because some men who are transvestites are saying in social media at the moment that lockdown, because of the COVID-19, is very harmful for them. If they are unable to go out and try to be recognized as women, they don't know who they are. So their femininity has to be recognized. Women have to recognize it. We have to be bothered, and we have to recognize it. These men might seek to shake a woman's hand in the women's toilets, for instance, and they like to imagine that people see them as female. They get naked in women's changing rooms, they compete on women's sports teams, and so on. They do all this with the backing of large swathes of the left, of governments, local councils, rights organizations. They've been much more successful even than the paedophiles were back in the 70s. But the fight back is well underway. It is feminists who have fought the way in which exercise of the male sex right harms women and children. We have fought against rape, prostitution, pornography, paedophilia, and sadomasochism. We have a new fight on our hands against the transgender rights movement. In this fight, we find ourselves up against men's fury at the idea that we may limit their freedoms, and particularly their sexual freedom. We're struggling to get the weight of male sexual oppression off our backs, and can seem to always be on the back foot. But we have had some considerable successes. And in this struggle too, we are gradually making ground. It would be good to be able to concentrate instead on building women's community and women's culture, creating real alternatives for women and girls, as we did back at the time of the women's liberation movement. That time will come again. But first, we have to extirpate the idea that men have sexual rights and can require recognition of their sexual fantasies, and seek to inhabit and thereby abolish women's rights as human rights.